Good morning. This is John Kogan. I'm the CEO of Performative, the online community for corporate finance, accounting, treasury, and related professionals. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, 15 Common Pitfalls of Financial Planning. In your company's planning process, do your financial analysts spend more time accumulating and consolidating data than they do analyzing it? Do your senior decision makers feel that they don't receive decision-ready data in a timely fashion? And do people frequently ask how the data will be used or who will see it? These can all be warning signs that you're experiencing problems with planning. This webinar will explore 15 of the most common pitfalls that companies experience in their long-range financial planning. You'll learn how to identify pitfalls, diagnose how they impact your business, and find solutions to improve and optimize your long-range planning process. First off, I'd love to thank PlanView for helping us make this event possible. This, like everything on Performative, whether it's an event, our annual conference, or the website, is free. And it's due to the generous support of folks like PlanView, who certainly know an awful lot about today's content. Next up, I'd like to introduce Performative. To those for whom this is your first experience with Performative, we're the largest and fastest growing online resource for senior finance and related professionals. We reach well over 500,000 of these folks, CFOs, controllers, treasurers, and the like, every month. And all we do is answer one another's questions. It's a very simple proposition. If you have a question, you can pop it out on Performative, and you get all sorts of peers and subject matter experts answering them, and it's all completely free and noise-free. And by noise-free, we mean no ads and no self-promotion allowed. So it's a really nice place to come, learn, and get work done. Please check us out at performative.com. Next up, a few notes on today's event. A link to today's presentation and the video of this webinar and to a white paper will be sent out to all attendees within 24 hours of the event and will be posted on performative.com. It's actually the presentation itself is already out there, and the white paper and the webinar recording will be out shortly. To those who would like CPE credits, hopefully you pre-registered for CPE credits. If you did not, don't worry. Please contact Tanya Walsh. You can see her email address right there, and she will take care of you. If you did pre-register for CPE credits, just make sure that you take the 2 polls during today's presentation. There'll be one right around the middle, one towards the end, and just make sure you take those, and then Tanya will make sure you get your CPE certificates. We'd like to ask that you please ask questions today. We want this to be an interactive experience. If you'll take just one moment to take a peek at your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see there's a section there called Questions, and feel free to ask any question at any time. Now, if it's a clarifying question, we might answer it during the event. If it's a more substantive question, we will most likely wait until the end of the event when we get to our Q&A with today's speaker, who I will introduce shortly. But please feel free to ask questions at any time, and we'll do our best to get to them during the presentation. Finally, when we are done, when you step off this webinar or when we shut down the webinar at the end, you'll be asked to take a short survey regarding today's webinar. We always want to do better, so please let us know what you thought of the webinar, good, bad, or ugly, hopefully not ugly. And also, we make it very easy for you to request direct connection with today's speaker. So please let us know if you want a direct connection with today's speaker. It's simply a checkbox on that survey. So very simple, and we'll do the connecting, and we're happy to do that. A number of learning objectives today, but at the end of the day, we want you to be able to see where you might get trapped in some of the pitfalls in the financial planning process, and then how you can overcome them. And learning about them now will certainly help you avoid many of them. So in order to help us today and lead us down the path, I would like to introduce Madison Laird, who is the CEO and co-founder of a company called CPM Methods. Madison is a veteran of corporate performance management and has extensive experience in strategic planning with large, mid-sized, and small companies. Madison's experience in performance management and strategic planning includes perspectives from large companies like IBM and Cisco, GM, which is to say general manager roles at mid-sized companies, and CEO roles at small companies. Madison has received numerous honors throughout his career, including a Catalyst Challenge Award from the CFO at Cisco and a nomination by AT&T for Ernst & Young's Entrepreneur of the Year Award. Madison has many publications to his credit, including a recent white paper entitled The 15 Pitfalls of Financial Planning. And that, by the way, is the white paper that will be linked, to which we will send you a link after today's event. He has lectured at numerous business programs, including the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University, NYU Stern School of Business, and the Keenan Flagler School of Business at UNC. And he's taught an MBA course in Hong Kong to boot. An amazing background, perfect person to tell us how to stay out of trouble with financial planning. Madison, please take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Sean. I also want to thank Performative for hosting the event and PlanView for sponsoring the event. And just kind of by way of overview, let everybody know that I'm suffering through a bit of a head cold, so if there's a moment of awkward silence, I'm just putting the phone on mute while I blow my nose or cough or whatever I need to do. But we'll try and get through this here. So the 15 Pitfalls of Financial Planning was a white paper commissioned by PlanView. And the reason that PlanView decided to ask and look externally on what kind of the deep dive on some of the financial planning pitfalls was that they commissioned a study in the fall of 2011, which was benchmarking the planning process. They call it the state of capital planning. We'll talk about terminology in just a moment. That goes by different words at different companies. But the survey is really all about identifying market pain points and risks in the planning process, as well as challenges to the planning process. It also looks at the effectiveness of the planning process and tools that are used in the capital planning process. I would encourage you actually to peruse this study as a way to kind of benchmark your organization against where most respondents said that they were, because it is a very comprehensive study conducted by, as you can see, FERF, which is a research affiliate of FEI, Financial Executives International, which a lot of you may be members of and may have been at the conference in Orlando recently. So as FEI did that survey, they came back with a number of pain points and risks and challenges in the planning process. And PlanView said, let's do a deep dive to really understand what the potential pitfalls or pains are in financial planning. And so there is a white paper which all of you will receive entitled The 15 Pitfalls of Financial Planning. What we will do today is go over those in a more abbreviated form. The first thing to realize about the pitfalls in financial planning, and actually before we get started, I said that I would talk about terminology just a little bit, and I do want to do that. So different firms call this process different things. At your company, it may be the planning process or LRP or long-range planning process or the capital planning process. What we're really talking about in scope is whatever exercise a company goes through which leads to its annual budgeting. So when you look at the 15 pitfalls that we'll work through here together, the first thing that I'd like to point out is that what I say to people is that nobody has all of them, but everybody has some of them. There is no perfect planning process. So what I encourage people to do is always look at the pitfalls that we will go through and talk about here through the lens of your company that you're in. It's possible that you exhibit some of the symptoms of one of the pitfalls, but in certain cases it might actually be appropriate for your organization to have that particular approach. So while there are warning signs, these are things to look for, and always filter them through the lens of your organization. Finally, the best, there's a timing issue here as well. The best planning process for a company can really vary dramatically from company to company, and actually even in the same company from year to year. It's one of the what worked before may not work again kind of things. So the white paper, actually, which all of you will receive, follows the same format for each one of the 15 pitfalls. And that format is a description of what the pitfall is, some symptoms so that you can diagnose it within your organization, and then a little bit about what the impact is. In other words, if this pitfall exists and you start to manifest some of the impacts of the pitfall, then you can understand and look for some possible approaches for avoiding it. In this climate, in fact, what works even at the beginning of a planning process cycle may not work at the end of that cycle. So what I mean by that is some of these pitfalls are ones that may only surface during the course of the planning process itself. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of structure and flexibility in designing the process in the very beginning and how that can help prevent some of the pitfalls from occurring and then help you respond to them if those pitfalls occur. So that's a little bit of a macro perspective on how to prevent or remediate some or address some of the pitfalls. So this particular overview of common pitfalls breaks the 15 into a few key problem areas. I think there are 4 or 5. And then it does highlight 3 of those for discussion. And let me talk a little bit about the way that we did that. That's a classic kind of Venn diagram that we use to categorize the pitfalls. We actually used a rigorous scoring method to categorize each one of the 15 according to our experience with many firms' long-range planning processes and many of the responses that we got back from the survey. So you can see here that the 3 main criteria used were the most common pitfalls, the pitfalls with the greatest impact, and those pitfalls which are the easiest to address. So if you will, the sweet spot in the middle represents the intersection of those 3, meaning they're the most common pitfalls, they have the greatest potential negative impact on the firm, and they are also the easiest to address. You could consider them kind of low-hanging fruit. So if those particular pitfalls exist then in your organization, then at least that's something that you can begin to address right away. So these are marked in blue as we go through the presentation. And before we get into the pitfalls, it's time for our first polling question of the day.
Thank you very much. So this is the first of 2 polling questions that we've got today. For those of you who want CPE credit, you need to take this, but even if you aren't here for CPE credit, as you'll see, it's a very straightforward question. We'd love to hear what you have to say, and then we'll actually revisit this, the results of this in our other poll during the Q&A session. So we'll take a few moments here. During this break, I'd love to remind folks to ask questions. We already have a couple questions in the queue here, but ask questions as we go, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Q&A portion of today's program. I'm going to leave the poll open for another 10 seconds here. Go ahead and get your last licks in, and then we'll close it and get right back to Madison here so he can take us through the pitfalls. All right, I'm going to close it right now, and we'll hop right back to Madison. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I appreciate that.
Good.
The pitfalls have been organized into maybe 5 slides here that have a question at the top that are sort of the theme for that set of pitfalls. And if you're keeping track, 15 divided by 5 is 3. But not every question has 3. This one has only 1 particular pitfall. Some of the others have a few more pitfalls grouped together. But I did want to lead with this one because this pitfall is relatively common in those companies which do not have a strong strategic planning process run outside of finance by operations or strategy, for example. If there is no strategic planning process, and decision makers are relying on LRP data and information in order to create strategic decisions, there is a tendency for finance to be kind of perceived as running the strategic process as well. When this happens, sometimes our stakeholders can perceive that finance has so much control over the planning and budgeting process that our business partners will essentially say, why does it matter? They'll say things like, why does it matter what I think? Or, I'll go through the exercise for you, and they will kind of begrudgingly participate in the process. In this case, a potentially very valuable source of strategic ideas throughout the organization is actually missed in the planning process. So a better approach would include, and if you find yourself in this situation, I would urge you to get in front of it quickly, to get stakeholders on board immediately. And we'll talk actually at the close a little bit about some ways that you can do that. But greater objectivity and, generally speaking, greater objectivity and transparency in the planning process will go a long way toward instilling confidence by stakeholders. And then solicitation of strategic input, designing a solicitation of strategic inputs in the process. Some best practices for that include strategy sharing sessions and summits where information that's not always qualitative is captured and shared as well. That's another thing that we will get to in a future look at one of the pitfalls. So a second pitfall to look at is, and this is a kind of a common group of pitfalls as well, what kind of data is being asked for or requested in the process? And you can see one of these is at the intersection of the Venn diagram that's most common, biggest impact, and easiest to fix. And that's a pretty hot topic for those of us in finance today. It's treating all elements of risk the same way. And realizing that all forms of risk are not necessarily created equal is a way to go about crafting a solution to that. So the major message for the pitfall is to be very careful about the amount of information you request and carefully monitor, question, and understand the data that you receive. A lot of times what happens with financial analysts is we're afraid to push back, to ask questions of our business partners because we don't want to be perceived as nagging. But during the planning process, it's our responsibility to make sure that the input is realistic and vet that input. On the other hand, it's also our responsibility to design a process that doesn't ask for too much data. Granular information about headcount is an example of an area where planners tend to get a little carried away. Risk is an example of an area where people probably aren't granular enough at times. So we'll cover the importance of calibration of the data in a future pitfall. But even with good calibration, it is often not possible to capture all valuable strategic information in scoring systems. And it is not appropriate sometimes to do so. And frequently, nothing takes the place of a good PowerPoint presentation that's qualitative when it comes to communicating business strategy. So the message there, especially in the objective obsession pitfall, is that a lot of times we tend to impress ourselves and get carried away with the amount of objective data we request when really what we're doing is kind of shadowboxing our way through the planning process and treating things objectively that don't necessarily lend themselves well to objective consideration. So a better approach involves a very careful thought and design process in the template creation methodology. You know, I've heard, and a lot of us sort of have this issue in finance of having too much data and too many reports and too many things to analyze and go through. And I heard an approach recently where a company just kind of said, you know, when we advise people in that situation, we tell them just stop publishing all reports for a quarter and then find out who asks for what report, who misses what report, and use that as your requirements gathering process in order to, you know, to turn it around. And if nobody asks for it, then they don't miss it, and it's obviously not something that is high on the list. And the same kind of goes for the data. You know, so in the planning process, when we ask for a lot of data, it's a good approach in determining what data to request involves going to decision makers and first getting their opinion of what framework they're going to use to create a funding profile that they can use to evaluate the options for their allocation of affordability. So that's a much better approach. I do want to say a quick word about a better approach on risk here also, which is that a lot of times we in finance get to the point that we try to boil risk down to a single score or factor. Frequently, if we're going to get more granular, we'll go to one or two factors, or maybe three factors. There are a lot of factors of risk: competitive risk, demand risk, supply chain risk, execution risk. There are a number that not only need to be considered, but need to be calibrated in response. Guidance needs to be provided for all of the various areas of risk. The concern, the impact, and there's a kind of a generic impact statement here that decision makers are often overwhelmed with considerations, many of them misleading. And risk is a great example of that, because risk is an area where a firm can unintentionally concentrate risk in one area. For example, competitive risk or execution risk. So if it's not making a distinction between different types of risk, it may think it's taking less risk with a particular strategy, or it may take a moderate risk with a particular strategy, or it may even choose to embrace some risk with a particular strategy. But if you don't have visibility into where the risk is concentrated, you potentially leave the firm exposed strategically. Now let's move on to our next group of pitfalls, which is the question about, are the right tools being used in the planning process? And this is, I would say, these scored very highly on the most common and most impactful. So in the Venn diagram, a lot of them were at the intersection of those two loops. Unfortunately, they don't really score highly on the easy to solve category. So you really, the impact is potentially very high from these pitfalls. And they are very common, according not just to Madison, but to the Capital Planning Survey commissioned by PlanView and FEI. And probably most of the people, or I would be willing to bet, like at least half the people on the call answered the polling question that Excel is the primary tool used for long-range planning in the company, only because I've been involved in poll after poll after poll, and the data pretty much always breaks down the same way. So unfortunately, what we have got ourselves into a position of, I think, in the finance community, is treating Excel for planning purposes kind of like a pair of old, comfortable shoes that we're used to wearing. And we don't know what new shoes can do for us, make us run faster and jump higher. We only know that, we're used to wearing them and they're comfortable to slip on until you see a firm use an alternative to a manual process. Then you start to understand not just that they have less pain in the numerical consolidation, resource-intensive process, but that strategically they're also a lot more nimble at creating scenarios, evaluating options, discovering various paths of affordability. So manual manipulation has the impact of making planning, I kind of soft-shoed this one, more about process and less about decision-ready quality output. What that really means is that when there's a manual planning process, literally kind of a lot of times just in the nick of time, we're able to go forward 3 years and look out and create a model in Excel that's purely based on business as usual. And sometimes we can create scenarios and solvers and things like that in Excel, and then what happens? We gather our data and somebody changes numbers and the scenarios tend to unravel or fall apart. So having a central repository that represents a single source of truth in the planning process, specifically for strategic decision making, really put a firm on significantly better footing than its competitors. What happens frequently is the second pitfall, which is that a company will decide, well, we need to create a solution to this manual planning process or planning problem, and they end up, instead of looking at their requirements and assessing what's available, they look at what's available only within the company. So I call it kind of the square peg in the round hole, where a lot of times some of the tools, like an ERP system, will be informative, but not appropriate for the planning process, which is designed to align parts of the organization with each other and create scenarios that are project-based and nimble enough to create optimized portfolios. So unfortunately, a lot of times we try to leverage tools that already exist in the organization, and they're not necessarily designed for planning. When that happens, unfortunately, that can actually be even more injurious to the planning process than using a manual approach. So using the wrong tool is often worse than using no tool at all. So a better approach would include developing the constructs first. Actually, that is the second bullet there is the kind of the key solution. So explain what constructs need to be created in order to create a solution to the problem. Because typically, what then ends up happening is that if the constructs aren't created first, if what we call as CPM methods a funding profile isn't created first, then there is no way to create the scenarios or constructs that will actually support decision making. So the thing that we like about the plan view solution is that plan view captures the data in such a way that it does enable the creation of constructs and scenarios and what we call funding profiles on the fly. So finding the kind of right tool to address the problem makes not just the planning process easier and smoother, but gives much more clarity of mind and insight and decision-ready output. Let's look at the next group of pitfalls where the question becomes, is the right level of guidance being issued by the company? And this is, as you can see, one of the most kind of common and impactful and easiest to solve pitfalls comes in this area. So there are some pretty nuanced but important differences between the two pitfalls, premature destination and self-fulfilling prophecies. But I think we can kind of talk about them together here, which is if in the planning process a range is provided in the beginning to shareholders, to the business leaders, the information that they provide back, being within that range, will predetermine kind of what the outcome is. Essentially what's happening, as the premature destination bullet says, is that this process really conflates planning and budgeting. So both of these lose, in both of these cases, finance loses a chance to gain valuable strategic insight that could educate our CEOs and CFOs to make the decisions about affordability that they need. Essentially what ends up happening is we tweak our current year a little bit in order to create the budget for next year by just seeing who's doing better and who's doing worse and moving money around a little bit, as opposed to giving a wider range to a company and then to the various parts of the company and asking them to populate scenarios within wider ranges. So one of the things that, again, we use PlanView for, frankly, is to create these scenarios based on the data that's accumulated, because the ranges that are issued and targets that are issued within the system can dictate various bounded ranges for various scenarios during the planning process. At the corporate level, what that means is visibility into the various possibilities, because if the business leaders are then providing several bounded ranges rather than having a window that one window they have to hit within, then you've got a much more strategic view of how to allocate your operating expense and capital expense across the company. So that really allows business owners to reflect the strategy in their own portfolio optimizations rather than relying on corporate to do it themselves. And I should probably mention one other thing on this, which is that, that last bullet talks about providing tools to manage portfolio options within ranges of defined guidance. And I was mentioning that and kind of alluding to that, but having a system, a tool that allows you to manage the portfolio optimizations within those ranges is an invaluable approach. So a central repository that has that kind of capability is one that results in a much improved planning process. Well, the next group of pitfalls ask the question, is all the collected data being analyzed properly? So once we've got all this information together, once we've collected it all, are we actually looking at it correctly? So there are 2 or 3 kind of common pitfalls that we fall into here, and I call them data inequality, class warfare, forecast folly, and pragmatic profiling. So you can read about what those are and what the potential diagnosis and impact is, and how to address those particular issues. But there are a couple of kind of key best practices that I want to hit on. I mean, if you have some of these problems, the impact in the organization is incalculable. So these are not necessarily easy to solve problems either, but if you have some of these problems, then the impact is potentially extreme to the company, because decisions about how to allocate funds become based on incomplete, unreliable data sets. They can even be directionally inaccurate. And this is something that's reflected in the survey that was provided, it was sponsored by PlanView and FEI. One of the greatest, this was the respondents saying one of their greatest concerns is that the wrong things are being funded. And I think that one was over 50%. And that was chilling to me. When I read that, and here are finance folks saying, we're concerned that we may be funding the wrong things within our companies. So how do you avoid some of that, some of those problems? So if you trace this back to the 4 pitfalls, are we looking at the data right through the right lenses? You begin to look at things like, well, are we using the same assumptions for everything in the portfolio, or do we have different assumptions for longer-term initiatives, for non-revenue generating initiatives, for example? I mean, there's a tendency for everything to be reduced to NPV in some companies, and that's not always an appropriate analysis point. We recognize that there are strategic interdependencies. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is putting everything into an NPV bucket and then analyzing everything by an NPV list obviates the timing of the investments in revenue streams, the risk involved with the revenue streams. So there are a number of other considerations that are relevant. You probably want to use different risk scoring approaches for different parts of the portfolio. You want to use different assumptions about growth initiatives than you do about investment initiatives. So there are a number of different considerations that say, these things need to be put in some different buckets. So a couple other problems that when we start to look at data analysis that we commonly encounter are the folly of forecasts. So a lot of times we have single point forecasts rather than forecasts that reflect confidence levels, especially in a lot of companies, even in the second year and third year. Those are kind of distorted as point forecasts unless we have some kind of bounded range that quantifies uncertainty. There's also the tendency to kind of reduce, and I talked about this, reduce all evaluations of financial criteria, and the example of NPV, which would minimize the role of strategy. So that's why if some of these pitfalls exist within the organization, then you end up in a place where decisions can be based on bad data or even be directionally inaccurate. And a lot of times you end up in a place where you're better off making gut instinct calls about the business, frankly. So what would be a better approach? Well, some of the best practices include calibrating answers with specific guidance, even calibration sessions. So one of the things that I've used PlanView before in the past is for calibration, where guidance is issued on how to answer a competitive risk situation. So, for example, and you need to be really specific on calibration here. So, for example, we would say if your revenue forecast is off next year because competitive response ends up being stronger than you thought, would your forecast likely to be off by? And then you, on a 1 to 5 basis, you do the banded range, less than 5%, 1 to 3%, less than 1%, etc. So giving really specific guidance ensures that everyone within the organization has the same frame of reference to answer questions the same way. And in some cases, I've actually seen, as a best practice, calibration sessions where business leaders come together and they talk about how they answered the questions, because you'll get, that's an eye-opener, because you'll get some very different perspectives. Another better best practice approach is to ask for what I call asymmetric ranges of input rather than point forecasts. So even if you ask people to quantify uncertainty with an upside and downside, a lot of times what you'll get is people giving you the same downside and upside, so it's a symmetric kind of range. What you really want to ask people to think about as they do their planning is, what would happen, what would you do with 10% more or 10% less operating expense, for example, and then what would the impact on the business be? That's an eye-opener, because people will then start to make their own optimizations and bring forward to you kind of decisions about what is prioritized within the portfolio. And finally, I would say create evaluation criteria for different aspects of the portfolio, which also incorporates strategy. What I mean by that is, if you have 2 or 3 buckets: run the business, scale the business, grow the business, for example, there would be different criteria used for each one of those buckets to evaluate the projects in those buckets. And not to harp on PlanView, but again, this is a place where the PlanView tool, because of their kind of IT project portfolio management background, lends itself very well in the planning process to being able to handle those kind of optimizations. I think this is our last set of pitfalls, and that is, does the planning process support corporate goals? When you talk to analysts, this is the thing in the financial analyst community. This is a common thread that you get pretty frequently. If you just ask the question, and probably most people on the call know this already, but if you ask the question, are companies, how big a problem is it, if the problem exists, that companies don't link their strategic goals to their budgeting processes? Invariably, every analyst that I've talked to has said, yes, that is a big problem for most companies. I have seen and actually worked in companies where that's been done pretty well, but they are the exception rather than the rule. Very few companies kind of have a way to couple their strategic goals to their planning process. And so I call that goal misalignment, and that's where the planning process doesn't link the projects and priorities and initiatives in the budgeting process back with the corporate goals. And the impact, obviously, is that strategic goals often are not achieved, or if they're achieved by accident rather than by design. And so a better approach would really require linking planning requests to strategic goals. So a best practice that I've seen executed to great effect would require a quantification of a planning request to a strategic goal, a link back. And that way there is visibility across different scenarios that are created to the impact of that scenario on the corporate goals. In other words, if you have affordability as a company and you can spend it in scenario A that emphasizes services, scenario B that emphasizes emerging markets, or scenario C that is kind of a growth initiative scenario. The idea of being able to say, if we do A, this is the link back to our corporate goals, and which goals we'll be emphasizing. And B will result in this kind of emphasis. We'll take this much risk, the portfolio is likely to evolve this way if we spend our money on emerging market scenario B. If we spend our money on scenario C, and that is a growth initiatives and investment initiatives, here's the timing of the revenue streams, here's how much risk we will take, and therefore, here's how the corporate goal alignment will unfold. So when we use a tool like a plan view to create those linkages between products and corporate goals, we do it not just with a business as usual mentality, but also with a scenario-based mentality that will give decision makers the option of saying, an educated choice to say, if I spend my money this way, this is what I'll get. If I spend my money this way, this is what I'll get. If I spend my money this way, this is what I'll get. And these are how the various spends relate to the corporate goals in those cases. So let me just kind of say a few final words here, and then we'll open it up for questions. There are a few things that I put as kind of do's and don'ts here, and I'll just go ahead and build them all out. But striking the first one is really important. Striking the right balance between being visionary and being practical is a lot harder than it sounds. I'm sure a lot of you live this issue every day. So some best practices I've seen to help do this involve a lot of design in the front of the process. Design that starts with understanding customer requirements, customers in this case being the decision makers. Brainstorming sessions and interviews with those decision-making leaders to find out what criteria they will ultimately use to make their decisions will go a long way toward helping you be visionary. Now, the best practices to prevent impracticality involve running the same kind of feedback sessions up front, just with the business leaders from whom you'll be requesting data. And another best practice involves running surveys from year to year and tracking that information, and then making the changes on the feedback that you hear, and then holding debriefing sessions to actually explain what feedback you've received and how you intend to act on that feedback. The second bullet here is be a consensus builder throughout the planning process, but don't be indecisive. There's a great set of Harvard Business Review articles, and I just picked up Harvard Business Review On Point, some selected articles from Harvard Business Review in summer 2012. They devoted the whole issue to the concept of managing in an uncertain environment and how leaders and organizations need to behave in this climate. It was a famous U.S. president who said, "Be sure you're right and go ahead," but that was many years ago. And that approach doesn't work today. And this issue, this collection of articles really explains why. So the point is, get folks moving together in the same direction in the planning process, and be decisive even if on the inside you're not sure that the same process is going to work throughout the entire planning cycle. And that gets to our next point about how to reduce uncertainty. And here the point that we want to make is that, ironically, these two of being process-oriented and being flexible are not at odds. In fact, interestingly enough, the better and more detailed you are in your process design in the beginning of the LRP cycle, the more flexible you will be later on. If you are being a consensus builder, that means you're listening and incorporating feedback. And if you have designed a process, the worst thing you can do is stick to your guns in that process in light of a lot of evidence that that process is broken or it's not working. So the more that you've designed the process, and think of a Visio diagram here, the more you've designed a flow chart that describes the process, the better able, if you need to change a meeting date or a template or a part of the process in terms of the number of scenarios that are calculated. We see this with clients all the time. But the more that you've designed the process, the easier it is to respond to those changes in cycles, where you can just change, you can take out a box or say we still need to do this or that, or we can give up on this, and we could redesign things this way. On the other hand, if your planning process isn't well documented, then you are a lot more vulnerable to being inflexible. So finally, what I would say is throughout the process, be vigilant. Listen to what folks are telling you, but don't necessarily be overreactive. Never knee-jerk. I mean, I've seen this in the planning process where a common problem is one person will make a complaint and another person will make a kind of echo that complaint about the process. And a revamp or a decision is made to change the process just because a couple of people who are well-placed are sort of echoing the same thing, not because they thought of it independently, but because one heard the other say it and is kind of parroting that language. So there's a mix between being vigilant and knee-jerking on particular redesign issues. So I really want to save some time for Q&A. I want to thank everyone for their participation today and bearing with my cold here. And we'll turn it back over to John for Q&A here.
Great. Thank you very much, Madison. Great information, a lot there. Let's go ahead and jump into the second polling question real quick. We'll take another 40 seconds here to get this going. And then we'll go ahead and hop into the question. So once again, if you're here for CPE credit, definitely answer this question. If you're not here for CPE credit, answer it anyway. We'd like to see what's going on here, and we'll actually revisit this and the other poll in just a moment as soon as we're done. Also, another note, once again, if you have any questions for Madison, please ask them via the question area in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll work to get them in between now and the end of today's webinar. I'll leave this question open for another 5 seconds or so, so go ahead and get your vote in, and then we'll jump into taking a look at the results. And since we've got this one up already, let's go ahead and take a quick peek at the poll results and see what you think about this. So, Madison, what are your thoughts on seeing this result here when it comes to the biggest challenges faced in my company in the arena of financial planning, people, process, or technology? You surprised by this?
Not surprised by this at all. In fact, just about every company that has some kind of issues in planning ends up having to take a look at the planning process first. So you're getting a lower score than I would have expected on technology, so that surprises me a little bit. But what typically happens is that when the correct planning process is put in place, then companies are in a position to go and choose tools. In fact, this happened to me with a customer recently, where they had a a real need to revamp the LRP process. And they said, well, we'll put off the technology purchase for a while. And then they came to the point where they said, after we revamped the process and did the process out, they came back to me and said, hey, I think we probably need to go ahead and look at putting that tool in place. Right. So a lot of times what will happen is that the process, and the same with the people also, if the process is outlined and designed properly, then you fit the right people and the right technology solution into the process.
Got it. All right, thank you for that. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first poll while we're at it. I think this is going to surprise no one, at least while Madison. Is primary technology used in my company's financial planning process? And we have a lot of mid and large size companies on this call, and yet still Excel.
Yeah, that's even a little more dramatic than we usually see. So it's usually about 50% Excel. So the comment that I would have is it probably is a little higher composition of smaller and mid-sized businesses here. The thing that's telling is really the lack of kind of specific forecasting and planning software. So the kind of goes back to the pitfall of manual manipulation being the Excel one, and then taking the right tool for the job, and the right tool for the job really obviously is kind of in that third category there. And I use the analogy of a pair of old shoes that we've become comfortable with Excel, and that's really a telling analogy, because you don't get new shoes because you don't like the laces or you don't like the color, or occasionally the soles may wear out, but usually that's not what prompts us, because I get shoes resold frequently. Right, so those kind of things are things that if you find a pair of shoes that you like, you're just going to keep using them and wearing them. And it's not until you get that new pair of shoes that you realize what they mean to you. You can jump higher, run faster, look better, and so I kind of feel like we're probably the same way with Excel. You don't move away from Excel to solve the kind of pain in the process of putting stuff together. You're certainly going to realize that there's a much better way when you have a single repository with a single source of truth behind that. But a better reason to move away from Excel and to a specific forecasting and planning software package is the scenario capability that is enabled. And certainly there are certain things for Excel modeling that will still be relevant in the planning process. This isn't to suggest that Excel should just that we'll ever stop using Excel. I mean, I love my spreadsheets as much as anyone else. What I'm suggesting here is that to enable the use of Excel properly in the planning process, the creation of funding profiles that can be generated by various scenarios using specific forecasting and planning software really can't be underestimated. The quality of output in decision making is so much higher.
It's interesting. We actually do have a lot of mid and large size participants, participants on this webinar. And speaking from my own experience when I was both at Cisco Systems and Cardinal Health, we had enterprise-wide planning tools, but almost all of the analysis was actually done in Excel, and then those tools were just the repository for sort of the final resting place of the data, which then got rolled up by the corporate groups. So I'm wondering if, since we're asking the primary technology used in the financial planning process, whether that doesn't rope in a whole bunch of big company folks who are still using Excel, sort of down at the BU level, until they actually enter the data.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not positive, but I think both of the firms that you mentioned are PlanView customers, and what I can tell you is that it doesn't surprise me that large firms would use Excel. I mean, I've seen Excel used in the planning process in a Fortune 50 company.
Right. Oh, yeah. All right, let's move on. Actually, we have a comment from one person who says one reason Excel is so highly used is that many financial programs don't fit the business planning process, and thus the output from those financial programs is not useful. And I think we've probably all seen that as well. And to your point that the process is so critical, sometimes the technology doesn't actually fit it. Let's hop into a couple other questions here while we've got a few more minutes. Getting participation from outside of finance in the planning process is easier said than done. I'm sure we can all commiserate with that. How do you get that participation, that buy-in?
Yeah, so that's a very common problem. And this takes a concerted effort. So, and the thing that I advise clients on this is whatever your change management budget is for the planning process, double it, because just symbolically, the importance of making the commitment to involving yourself with stakeholders really it just can't be underestimated. So a couple of best practices for that involve getting everyone together. There are, whether you call them strategy sharing sessions or scenario sharing sessions, getting everyone to come, and it has a way of achieving two things. One, it kind of gets the calibration, but the second thing is everybody wants to, there's peer pressure there. Everyone wants to put their best foot forward and produce the best data and information that they can. So we talked earlier about how to sort of massage politically the discussions with the various business leaders on the amount of data that you're requesting and to get all of that right and settled and square up front. Once the data collection has begun, a best practice would involve getting everyone together to see that, in fact, their peers have also populated the same information and data, and it's a kind of a misery loves company thing where everyone shares the pain together.
Great. Let's do one last question. Let's see if we can get through this one quickly. But how does a company go about figuring out which of these pitfalls it may have?
Well, the white paper has a diagnostic for each one of the 15 pitfalls. So there is each one of the 15 is divided into a description of the pitfall. The second section for each of the 15 is how to tell if you've got that potential problem. And they are very specific. In many cases, it even tells you if you're hearing X, like what are you going to do with this data? Right? So that is indicative of a potential pitfall. If you hear that problem, then it probably means that you have pitfall X. So there are various diagnostics for each one of the 15 to be able to help you understand how to look for those in the organization.
Got it. Great. Very helpful. Well, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and get into a couple of last housekeeping items before we bid everyone adieu. First off, you will actually, sorry, this slide isn't quite up to date. As soon as you step off of this webinar, you'll be presented with a follow-up survey. We appreciate you taking just 1 minute to answer those questions. Also, we make it very simple for you to request a connection with Madison. We're happy to help you make that connection. Also, once again, if you have any questions about CPE credit, please contact Tanya Walsh, and you can see her email right there. The PowerPoint of this deck is already up on Performative.com. If you go to Performative.com/resources, it's probably the top item there since we just added it this morning. Freely available. Also, we'll send you an email with a link to that and a link to the white paper, which Madison has mentioned a couple of times this morning. We would certainly love to thank our sponsor today, PlanView. Without them and their generous support, we wouldn't be able to put on events like this at no cost to the users. As Madison mentioned many times, they have great technology for this space. And Madison, thank you so much for your time today. I know you're a little under the weather, so you get extra credit for sticking with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.
And with that, we'd like to wish everyone a fantastic remainder of your week. We hope to see you again on Performative.com or at another Performative event. I hope you found this interesting, educational, and valuable, and we appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all next time.